Tony Cisneros, owner and operator of Alpventures World War II tours. I'm in Sagan, Poland today, and this is the site of Stalag Luft 3C. It was a prisoner of war camp, and this section was for the British. This is where the Great Escape took place on March 24, 1944. The Great Escape movie was based on a book written by Allied prisoner Paul Brickell. The Nazi regime operated hundreds of prisoner of war camps in occupied Europe during World War II. Nearly 100,000 American prisoners were held behind the wire in German prisoner of war camps. We always hear about the encirclement of Bastogne in the Battle of the Bulge, and of course the heroic actions of the 101st Airborne Division there, holding the line around Bastogne, but few people know that the city of St. Vith was also encircled. It's a topic you don't hear about much, but in the winter of 1944, nearly 8,000 Americans were captured and taken as prisoner by the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge. These American prisoners were mostly comprised of soldiers from the 106th Infantry Division. This is their story.
Meet the World War II experts who work on the battlefield. This is the Bunker Boys Show with your host, Tony Cisneros.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Bunker Boys Show. If you're even remotely into World War II, you know what to do. I'm very excited about today's episode. We have co-host Reg Jans back, and he will be interviewing Carl Wouters. Some of you may have never heard of Carl Wouters before, but I guarantee you this won't be the last you see of this young man. He is extremely sharp, and he is the authority on the 106th Infantry Division at the Battle of the Bulge. So without further ado, here's Reg Jans and Carl Wouters.
It's been a while since you saw me here, but I'm so happy to be back again to share the stories of the men we love so much, our World War II veterans. Today we're going to talk about the Battle of the Bulge, more specifically 106th Infantry Division and their role in that battle. Our guest today, Belgian historian Carl Wouters, expert and authority on the 106th Infantry Division. Welcome, Carl. Welcome to the Bunker Boy Show.
Thank you, Reg. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's good to see you. Though normally we see each other on the battlefields. Well, this time we have to do it this way.
Yep.
Now we've chosen to talk about a unit that not many people talk about. Now, the Golden Lions, 106th Infantry Division. Now, you have a special connection with them. But first of all, where did your interest start in World War II history?
Well, initially my interest in World War II history started with stories I learned from my own family. So my great-grandfather was a World War I and World War II veteran. During World War II, he was a POW in Poland for a couple months. And gradually from that, my interest kind of developed into general World War II history, and then more specifically, Battle of the Bulge and the U.S. Army involvement there. And so that got me interested in the battle in general. And on a trip to St. Vith, sometime in the 1990s, when I was on a Langlauf trip with school, I first saw the monument there to the 106th Division. And that was around the time World War II got real interest in the mainstream media, like in movies, Saving Private Ryan, series like Band of Brothers, got World War II back to the general public. And that kind of jump-started it for me as well, learning more about the Battle of the Bulge specifically, and then choosing the 106th as a unit to focus on to learn more about their history, basically.
Yeah, because it's strange, because most people, when they start reading about it or watch movies, it's always about the 101st Airborne Division, 2nd Armored Division, but not much the 106th Division or any of the other 59 divisions that were deployed during the Battle of the Bulge. Now, the 106th, that was like a quite new division, wasn't it?
Yeah, the 106th actually has a history that dates back to 1943 when they were first activated at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. So that was their first birth as a division. And they had a long history of training. They went to Tennessee on maneuvers in January 1944. And then after D-Day, you see that units fighting in Europe already, they start to get a lot of casualties and they need reinforcements. They need replacements. So what they did was they kind of started to take troops from divisions that were still in the training phase in the United States and taking manpower from them and using them as overseas replacements for other divisions already fighting in the ETO. And that's exactly what happened to the 106th. Was they were well on the second stages of their training schedule when the division was kind of depleted in terms of manpower. A lot of the fighting strength of the division was stripped from the unit and sent to other units overseas. And that kind of left the 106th in a difficult position. So to get it back to strength, they started getting a lot of replacements from units like programs like the ASTP, Air Cadet programs, all sorts of training programs in the States that were being discontinued. And the men in those programs were shifted to the infantry. And most of them ended up in the 106th to get back to strength.
So basically, when they got to the European theater and they were first kind of deployed at the Belgian border, they never seen combat.
No. Apart from a few exceptions, mostly officers and NCOs who had seen prior combat in North Africa or Sicily and who had been sent back to the States on leave and sent to another division. There were very few veterans in the 106th. So most of the regular GIs in the infantry companies and the artillery, they were they just came out of college and were drafted into the army and had no prior experience in the army. So that was their first baptism of fire, so to speak, when they arrived in Belgium.
When they got to Belgium, if you look at the lines, the defensive lines after the liberation of Belgium in September 44, you can see these American units are deployed directly at the border of Belgium with Germany. But that wasn't the case for the 106th. They actually were the only unit that were dug in, like inside of Germany. How come?
Yeah, that's right. That was something that set the 106th apart from most of the other units on their left and right flanks, was that they were actually holding a salient position inside Germany itself. They were on a ridge line in the Schnee area of Germany. So that's the very western border of Germany with Belgium. And so in that position is actually where the German Siegfried Line, or the German West Wall, runs alongside the Belgian-German border. And in September of 1944, that was an area that was actually very heavily fought over by the 4th Division. The 4th Infantry Division, who initially landed in Utah Beach on D-Day, had come there in September and actually had some pretty intense fighting to capture those German pillboxes and trenches on top of that fairly significant wooded hill called the Schnee Ridge. The ridge was important for two key points, I think. First, because it was part of the German West Wall. It had a lot of fortifications built on top of it in the late 1930s by the German army as part of their defense line against Belgium and France on the opposite side. So it has a strategic importance, but not so much for the U.S. Army in 1944, because most of the firing portals and the defensive capabilities, of course, of those bunkers were all pointed in the wrong direction, because the advance of the Allied armies was going towards the east, while the defensive capabilities of those bunkers were obviously pointing towards the Belgian border on the western side. So the army at the time saw it as more of a symbolic victory over the Germans. It was one of the first breaches of the Siegfried Line. And they intended to keep it. So they weren't going to give that heavily fought over ground back to the Germans, even though it probably was in a defensive capability, somewhat of a gamble to them, because it's heavily wooded. You need a lot of manpower to adequately defend it. And that was one of the problems actually that the 106th faced in December of 44.
Yeah, because if you're familiar with the area and you see that ridge, it's massive. It's like a really big ridge. So if you have to deploy your men up there, these lines are really thin because you have to stretch them out as far as you can.
That's true. That's one of the problems they faced. They had 2 out of 3 regiments of the division posted on that hill. So it's about 6,000 infantrymen that were deployed along that ridge line.
So you said they were like a salient inside of Germany, but that makes you very vulnerable, especially on the flanks, because there's no direct support, infantry support on your flanks. So on December 16, Germany launched their surprise attack, the Von Rundstedt Offensive, Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge. So you're in a very open position. So what happened?
Well, the problem that the 106th faced was the overextension of their lines. It was a 27-mile front that they had to defend with one division. And Army doctrine at the time says normally you can defend about 5 miles of frontage with one infantry division. So they faced about 5 times as much ground that they needed to defend. So that caused, like you said, a lot of large gaps between units. A lot of squads and platoons were really isolated from each other, and that caused the Germans to infiltrate between units, not only in the flanks of the division itself, but also between regiments, between companies, cause a lot of confusion on that first day of the battle. They started, of course, with a massive opening barrage that cut most of the communication lines. A lot of the artillery that came in on that morning, Nebelwerfers, 88s, any type of caliber ordnance that you could find was directed at their lines, and most of it cut the communication lines from those front units back to the Division CP in St. Vith, which caused problems, of course.
The Germans attacking in that area, their main objective was St. Vith, right? Why was that?
Well, St. Vith, much like Bastogne to the south, was a major road and rail hub in the area. It had a lot of roads leading in, a lot of roads leading out, and it was critical for the German offensive to get to Liège, to get to the Meuse River, and eventually Antwerp. So in order to get the German 5th Panzer Army under General von Manteuffel to the Meuse and eventually Antwerp, it was necessary for them to get St. Vith and the main road access that runs through it intact, so to speak. So they needed to get it.
According to the German plan, when were they supposed to take St. Vith?
Well, St. Vith was actually supposed to be taken on the second day of the offensive, so very high value target. 17 December 1944 was the German intent to be in St. Vith and to use those roads and rail lines to their benefit. But of course, we see that due to the stubborn resistance of the men of the 106th Division along the line there, they were not able to get that objective on time.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, a bit later on in the show. Let's go back to that December 16. You got the Schnee Eifel Ridge. The opening barrage starts after about an hour of intense artillery fire. German troops, infantry, armor units cross the Belgian border. So, and there they are on that ridge, like as a salient inside of Germany. So, did they fight back, or what happened?
Yeah, it's actually a common misconception when people read or learn about the 106th. Is stories that often get told is that the division just stood up and ran. That's the story that goes around in some of the books about the Battle of the Bulge, that the 106th didn't really put up a fight. And I can tell you, after studying it for many years, talking to a lot of veterans, that the entire opposite is true. So what they experienced was actually a massive flood of German infantry and armor directed at their positions, and mostly the flanks, as you talked about before. To the north, they had the 14th Cavalry Group, which was actually attached to them, which was holding the Losheim Gap, a very important tactical objective for the Germans, because that's pretty much where they came through in 1940 during the initial phase of the Blitzkrieg in the West. There was that point of invasion of the Low Countries there, the Losheim Gap. So you see in December 1944, almost 4 years later, they do exactly the same thing and push through the Losheim Gap on their way to Antwerp.
They did put up a heck of a fight, but ultimately, in order not to get completely surrounded, the order came to withdraw back to the Belgian border. Now, General Alan Jones, was he given a clear order to withdraw the two regiments of the division from the Schnee Eifel Ridge back towards St. Vith?
Well, during those first few days, you see him trying to get a grasp on the situation, trying to reorganize his troops as much as he can, but giving them orders to hold initially, hold that ridge line. It's key for the offensive into Germany in the spring, so that was his main order. But you see, after a few days, when the situation around the 106th also starts to get a little bit fluid, 28th Division is being pushed back, the 99th to the north is receiving heavy action. The 106th is encircled on the morning of the 17th. At least the two regiments that were up on the Schnee Eifel Ridge, they're encircled. So Jones is faced with a problem. He has 2/3 of his infantry division that's pretty much stuck behind enemy lines, and he's given reinforcements that have to come all the way from Holland to the north, being the 7th Armored Division, which is supposed to create an escape corridor for his embattled regiments that are behind enemy lines and trying to hold St. Vith. That was the main objective. So Jones gets on the phone with General Middleton in Bastogne, the 8th Corps commander, and they talk about what to do with the situation. The situation is critical at that stage. The encirclement is happening. So Jones wants to know what to do. Does he have to pull his regiments off of the Schnee Eifel and get them back closer to his division headquarters, or should he leave them in place and wait for reinforcements to come in and save the day, pretty much? And that telephone conversation happened, but it was like some Zoom sessions in present day, was hampered with problems. The connection get cut several times. Neither of the two generals seemed to really get full understanding of what's being talked about, what's being discussed. So Middleton, on his end, in his belief, he gives the initiative to Jones and says, if you think you should pull your regiments off of the line and get them back to St. Vith, that's your call. But like I said, the telephone conversation was garbled. There were a lot of cuts. Actually, what ended up happening was both generals had a different viewpoint on what was being, what was happening, and what was being ordered. Actually, so Middleton thought he gave the initiative to Jones, and Jones thought Middleton didn't give me an order to pull them out, so I'm keeping them in place, and that kind of sealed the regiment's fate. The two regiments that were stuck there on the Schnee Eifel. Yeah. So eventually, on the 18th of December, faced with the situation, the encirclement, the Germans are at the gates of St. Vith. Jones gives a radio message to the regimental commanders who were encircled and tells them to about face, to do a 180 of their battle lines and continue the fight to their rear towards Schoenberg, a village on the Our River right on the Belgian-German border.
Yeah. So actually, on the 18th, these guys on the Schnee Eifel Ridge received the order for a fighting withdrawal back towards St. Vith.
Exactly.
So, well, it's impossible to do that if you don't have any heavy artillery support. But I think they still got the 105s, 155s in support.
They had initially, when they started out, they had two battalions of 105s, one battalion of 155s organic to the division, and another 155 millimeter battalion in close support was the 333rd Field Artillery, a segregated battalion that was attached to the 106th by 8th Corps. So, but on the evening of the 16th, the first day of the battle, you saw that all these artillery battalions were being pulled out of the front lines. They were being evacuated by divisional artillery to set up in secondary positions behind the Our River. And that left the two regiments, eventually got stuck on the other side of the Our without any artillery support. There was only one battalion, 590th Field Artillery, that remained within the encirclement to provide support fire. But of course, their ammunition was soon depleted.
Yeah. So these regiments started fighting back towards the Belgian border, which means coming off the ridge, going downhill. It slopes down. You cross the border, get in the valley, go a bit up again, and then you dive into the Our Valley in the town of Schoenberg. Did they all manage to get across the Our River on time?
No, not at all. So what we saw was when the battalions of artillery were being pulled out, they successfully made it across the Our and back to St. Vith. One of those battalions was the 589th Field Artillery Battalion, supporting the 422nd Infantry Regiment. They were actually right on the verge of getting through Schoenberg when the German pincers closed in on the town and closed the trap, so to speak.
So coming in from the opposite direction of the ridge.
Yep. Yeah. So the 589th was one of those key units, later stages of the Battle of the Bulge, that just barely escaped the encirclement in the Schnee Eifel. They lost, out of their 12-gun battalion, they were left with 3 105 millimeter howitzers. The rest was all captured and destroyed.
Wow. So these guys now are in a fighting withdrawal back to Schoenberg. But then I believe a couple of thousands of them actually got stuck on that hill before they were able to cross the Our River, because apparently they were a bit late and they were actually cut off in Schoenberg.
Yeah, so the Schoenberg was captured morning the 17th of December. The regiments who were in the encirclement didn't give the order to go to Schoenberg until late on the 18th. So it was on the 18th and the 19th that they made that move towards Schoenberg. And on the 19th, they made a final attack trying to recapture the Ur River Bridge and get back towards St. Vith. But by that stage, German traffic through Schönberg you had a big traffic jam from the gates of St. Vith all the way to Schönberg, just filled with trucks and vehicles and manpower trying to get to St. Vith. And we were all Germans. So when the first American unit to reach the outskirts of Schönberg made it out of the woods, they saw a lot of vehicles with white stars, and they thought, well, here's the 7th Armored finally. But it turns out that these were captured vehicles that the Germans had used to transport all their troops to St. Vith. So there was some confusion again. Then the Germans saw that there were still American troops in that hill, and they opened up with artillery and anti-aircraft artillery, and it was big carnage there. And of course, by the 19th, most of those American troops hadn't really had food, water, medical supplies, were running low. They were low on ammunition, so they were fighting with straws by that time.
So on that day, they already been battling. Their baptism of fire lasted for already three full days.
Yep.
At that time, they didn't have proper intelligence, but by seeing the road from Schönberg to St. Vith being packed with German vehicles, they must have realized that
Yep.
they got completely stuck and completely surrounded.
And that was kind of the decision that the regimental commanders at that time took when faced with that high casualty number, because the Germans were really closing in on that sector, that little hill where those 6,000 men were stuck. Germans were coming in from all sides with all the stuff they had in their inventory. So a lot of artillery came down. Tree bursts caused a lot of casualties. Men hadn't eaten for days. Ammunition low, so there was really no recourse for them but to.
And they're actually stuck on that hill. There's nothing to defend. Just the only thing is like trying to stay alive.
Yeah, and there's no protection that you have there. Only the dirt where you try to dig into to provide some cover from the artillery shells blowing up all around, and that's pretty much.
And
situation they
were they all together stuck on that little hill, or were there a few others that managed to escape or reach some different area, different woods?
Yeah, you had some units that got separated during that fighting withdrawal to Schönberg, especially by the stage when they saw that the attack was not progressing well and that there was talk of potentially giving up and surrendering. There were some junior commanders, mostly lieutenants or platoon leaders, that still had some fighting spirit. They did just want to give up and they wanted to give it all, and they tried to find their way out of the encirclement. There was, for instance, an INR platoon, intelligence and reconnaissance, of the 423rd Infantry, who had been kind of a rear guard unit all the time. And when they first got word of a possible surrender taking place, they decided to infiltrate back to St. Vith, just going by dark through the woods and hiding by day. And eventually they made it intact. So that was the only intact unit of the 106th of that encirclement that was able to get out in one piece.
So they were able to sneak out at night and
yes.
Yeah.
And others, other small units that were caught in the heavy fighting on the 19th fell back to an area, was a motor pool area for the 422nd Infantry. It's located just south of the town of Laudesfeld in Germany. And it was a hillside, a bare hillside, where about 500 men of different units who had been seriously mauled during the fighting of that 19th December kind of fell back to. And there were two majors there, two battalion executive commanders who had seen their men through the fighting that day. And they decided to make a stand because they knew there was word of the 9th or the 7th Armored trying to make a break into the German lines and making an escape corridor for them. So they still had hopes by that stage that there would be some rescue for them. So you had these 500 men. They were called the Lost 500. They actually held out from the 19th till the 21st of December. So 2 more days of senseless fighting until they too had to surrender.
This is like a big part of Battle of the Bulge in American history, actually, because on the 19th, on that hill of Schonberg, I think you mentioned 6,000 plus Americans did surrender to the Germans.
Yep.
Did they get? Who gave the order to surrender?
Well, ultimately, it was the regimental commanders. There was Colonel George Deschanel. He commanded the 422nd Infantry Regiment, and Colonel Charles Cavender, who commanded the 423rd Regiment. They both, independently from each other, because there was no real coordination between them. They just went to Schonberg, to the objective, but there was no real coordination. They both, independently from each other, made the decision to surrender on the 19th to save lives, just to save lives, the lives of their men that they still had under their command, because they saw it was really a senseless slaughter. There was no hope of getting reinforcements, of getting resupplied even. There was no chance in hell that they were going to be able to get back with 7,000 men to St. Vith.
So it was not General Jones who made that call. It were the regimental commanders, because they had a better overview of the situation. They were closer to the man, so they were in the best position to make that decision at that specific moment.
They were right in the middle of it with the rest of the men. So, and interestingly enough, General Jones, who you mentioned, his son was actually a battalion staff officer in the 423rd. So his own son was one of the men who was captured on the 19th.
Wow.
So that caused probably some concern with General Jones.
Yeah. So they informed the man, they destroyed the guns or anything that the Germans could use. And how did it? It's not like in the movie that you walk down the hill with a white flag. Like how did it go? Did they?
Well, it kind of went like there was an officer who was sent down to the Germans to negotiate the terms of the surrender.
Okay.
So they would send an officer of senior rank, a major or a colonel, along with another officer or a soldier who knew German. And they would send him down to the German lines, waving anything white they could get their hands on.
So it was like a white flag kind of thing.
Yeah, in case of the 423rd, it was a white handkerchief. In case of the 422nd, it was a white undershirt that was used just to signal the Germans that they shouldn't open fire on this party. Yeah. So they went down and said, we have several thousand men here without ammunition, food, water. We have a lot of wounded, and we would like to offer you the honorable surrender of our troops. And then it was decided, Germans sent up a party with them to look over what was actually going on that hill. And then gradually the men filtered out of the woods and went into captivity.
Yeah. So after 3 days of fighting, holding off the Germans, like fighting for their lives, they had no options now. They're completely surrounded, no ammo, no food. You said it. So it was or whether surrender or die. At that moment. At the same time, the Germans had bypassed Schonberg and they were already knocking on the gates of St. Vith.
Yeah.
At that time. So what happened to the prisoners? Because I can imagine if you take like 5 or 10 or 20 or like maybe 100 prisoners, you know what to do. That's part of your training. But you captured like almost 7,000 of them. What did they do with them? What happened to them?
Yeah, pretty much that is a logistical nightmare for the Germans at that point. You
can't
have
take them with you.
No, you have to imagine they're having a lot of difficulties getting all of their forces on these narrow Ardennes roads, these very narrow trails, getting all their vehicles and all their troops to the front. And now you're suddenly faced with having to take care of 7,000 captured troops. You have to transport them back to the rear, guard them, give them food, water. And you have to get them to safety because now they're your responsibility. They're prisoners of war. They're protected by the Geneva Convention. So you have to take care of them. And now, of course, that wasn't always followed by the book, as we know from incidents like in Bonnier, the infamous Malmedy massacre, and other incidents all along the Bulge front where prisoners were executed.
By that evening, the Germans were building up their intensity and were starting to break through on both of our flanks. By about midnight, we'd lost communication on both flanks with the two units, so we knew we were being completely isolated. We could then, in the dawn's light, see that all of the roads leading into Saint-Vith were full of German troops concentrating on and going through Saint-Vith. We obviously could not counterattack. I attempted at that time to split them up into patrols so they could attempt to work their way back to the friendly lines, the U.S. lines. We started two of these patrols out and watched both of them captured. And shortly thereafter, I was captured with the remainder of the group. I was and still am proud of the men and officers of the 106th Infantry Division with whom I went through such a dreadful bath of blood during this action. I was so proud, as a matter of fact, that I returned to that unit after escaping from prisoner of war camp some 28 days later.
From then on, German troops are moving towards Saint-Vith. So there were two regiments that kind of surrendered. What happened to the third one?
The third one was the 424th Infantry, and they were positioned on the south flank of the division. So they were a bit further down. And what difference they had from a tactical viewpoint is they weren't on a ridge line like the two others were. They were also a little closer to the Belgian border. And that had to do with the 2nd Division, who was in that position before them. They had readjusted their lines in October, November 44, right before the 106 took over. Mm-hmm. So the 424th Infantry was in a tactically slightly better position. And also their regimental commander, Colonel Alexander Reed, he saw on the 17th that the Germans were trying to encircle his troops as well. And he took charge of a fighting withdrawal across the Our River.
So and they did make it back across the Our.
Yep. They did, and they set up shop on the high ground between Bracht and Berg-Reuland, mm-hmm. and tied in with the larger defense of Saint-Vith at that point.
Yeah. So now German armor, they're actually at the gates of Saint-Vith, trying to get across the Prummerberg. But what they didn't count on was there were little smaller elements that were attached or belonged to the 106th Division. We're still in that area, and mostly specific units that were not typically like fighting units. So what happened down there?
Yeah, what faced Saint-Vith at that point was when Schönberg was captured, you had one main road that led from Saint-Vith to the front line. That was the road from Schönberg to Saint-Vith. As the Germans put armor on that road, they were really threatening the division command post. So what General Jones then did was he called his division engineer, Colonel Riggs, and said he should take charge of 2 battalions of engineers and set up a straggler line initially along the Prummerberg. And the Prummerberg is actually a substantial wooded hill east of Saint-Vith, on the eastern outskirts of Saint-Vith, and through it run 2 main roads, the road from St. Vith to Schoenberg and the road from St. Vith to Schlierbach, and eventually to Steinebruck. Those were the two main advance roads that the Germans needed to get to St. Vith. So the Prummerberg defense was vital for the larger defense of St. Vith. And so you had the 168 Combat Engineers, which was a core unit that was attached to the division, mainly for road maintenance and building log shelters and things like that. And they were ordered to get their rifles, get their few light machine guns, and dig in on Prummerberg and go head-to-head with the German spearhead. And they did.
And how long could they hold? How long did they make a stand?
Well, they first started to build that line on the evening of the 16th, and eventually they held out until the 23rd of December.
The 23rd?
The day that St. Vith fell. They were basically the rear guard of the entire defense of St. Vith. They were holding that line and pretty much were abandoned at the very end while the other units pulled out of St. Vith when the St. Vith salient was being evacuated across the Salm River at Vielsalm. The 168 was tasked with holding the Germans as long as possible, and that they did their part again. Yeah.
So the Germans are focusing on St. Vith, hoping to take it on the 17th. They run into the 106th Division at the border. They basically overrun them. There's a fighting withdrawal back forward. They win the battle. 7,000 men surrender. Then they push further through. Other units reach St. Vith. And then again, there's this group of combat engineers with rifles holding that hill, the Prummerberg, until the 23rd. So 106 guys, they delayed the taking of St. Vith with about 6 days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 6 days. It's when you think about it, it really upset the timetable of the German offensive.
Yeah, and it buys a lot of extra time for the Allies to get organized, to bring in reinforcements, to start up the mobilization.
Yep.
Because that's a lot of time.
That's a lot of time. Actually enabled other units, like you say, like the 82nd Airborne, who's setting up at Werbemont and the Salm River, to create a secondary defense line for the German, to stop the German attack. And so that's the key importance of St. Vith, was delaying, not as much as stopping. It's initially the mission was more focused on stopping the Germans, but when they saw the overwhelming amount of troops that were being directed at them, it became a delaying action.
Yeah, it's kind of the same thing that happened to the 28 Infantry further to the south. Fighting for time.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So it's unbelievable, if you look at the history of the 106, this first week of the battle, it's amazing what they accomplished. It's really amazing.
It is. And to think that they were only there a week before the battle started, it's even more amazing. They had no time to prepare for what was coming. So, and given the circumstances they faced, I think they made a very valiant effort for their first engagement with the enemy. So.
I'm happy that you cleared this out, because many people don't want to talk about it. They think it's a disgrace of what these guys at the 106 did, because you don't surrender at any cost. But this was a completely different situation. There was no option. It would have been a massacre up that hill.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think you have to really get into the psyche of the commanders on that, at that point, who were on site, were the two regimental commanders that were both West Point graduates. So they knew all about warfare, and basically I believe they made the right decision, because they ultimately saved a lot of lives with their men. I think we can't rewrite history, of course.
No.
But if another unit would have been in their place, given the same circumstances, I have my doubts if the outcome would be different.
Yeah.
It's speculating, of course, but they faced a lot of issues there. They had inherited positions from the 2nd Division. They weren't allowed to make any adjustments in their layout of units, and so they basically lived by the rules until the battle began, and then all bets were off.
About what we've talked about so far, there's another story that starts almost at the Schnee Ridge, and you already mentioned the artillery, but there was like one battery of the 589 Field Artillery Battalion, commanded by a guy Erich Fisher Wood, and the whole story about Erich Wood has become probably the biggest myth in the Battle of the Bulge, because nobody exactly can tell what happened. So, but you've done a lot of research on it. I think you're the best guy to tell the story, the incredible story of Erich Fisher Wood.
Yeah, Erich Wood's story is one of those stories that is often referred in books about the Battle of the Bulge. It's one of those mythical stories that developed from individual GIs. So Erich Wood was a lieutenant in charge of a battery of 105 millimeter howitzers in the 106th. He was actually a battalion executive officer, but his commanding officer was missing in action on day one, so he took command of the unit. And so the artillery was withdrawn on the evening of the 16th and set up in secondary position on the Belgian-German border in order to, again, provide covering fire for troops still fighting in that Schnee area. And the morning of the 17th, they were being faced with a German armored and infantry attack coming straight at their position. And the 589th, his battalion, gets a march order. That means get out of this place and get back to your own lines as fast as you can. And so Erich Wood gives the order to his men, his 4 howitzers in his battery, to evacuate and to get on the road to St. Vith. Now, 3 of these howitzers were able to get on the road and get out. Now, this 4th howitzer of his battery is stuck in the mud and the grime, and they just don't seem to be able to get that piece out. So Erich stays behind. It's his responsibility, he feels, to get all of his men out in good order. And they work that gun. They get into the muck of the field and they push it. Eventually, they push it out on the road, and they head for Schoenberg, because Schoenberg, there's a bridge over the Ur River. And at the moment they reach the Ur River, the German pincers close in from left and right, and they just meet by chance that last truck of the 589th, and a German tank opens fire and hits the truck where Erich and his men are riding in. And they all get into the ditch by the side of the road, and Erich decides in an instant he's not going to be taken prisoner, and he runs up the hill. And the German bullets swoop by him left and right, makes it to the wooded edge, and disappears from view. The rest of the men of his unit are captured at that point, and their last vision of Lieutenant Wood is him running away from German gunfire into the woods. And now, the next day, there is a Belgian resident of the village of Mayroad near St. Vith, who is out in the woods looking for a Christmas tree. His name is Peter Moret, and he encounters 2 American stragglers in the woods. Two.
Okay.
One of them is a large American junior officer with one single bar on his helmet, a silver bar, and the other one is a regular soldier who carries a rifle. And he sees that these 2 men are very cold and they need shelter, so he offers them protection of his home, brings them home with them, They get food, they get a little warmth from the fire, and they offer him and the other soldier a bed for the night. Now at the dinner table, the lieutenant says he's going to try to make his way back to St. Vith, and he asks for directions from the family. And he says, well, if I'm not able to get back to St. Vith, I'm going to start my own private war in the woods. That's something he told the family.
He actually
later
said that, actually.
He said those words, and the family later testified to that fact that he said those words. So the very next morning, the 2 Americans disappear. And over the course of the next month, of course, May Road, it's very close to St. Vith, it's taken over by the Germans. You have troops of the 1st SS Division eventually getting there by the end of the month. General Dietrich, commander of the 1st SS Panzer Army. I think it's a 6th SS Panzer Army. He has his headquarters for a while there. And there's lots of disturbances in the woods. The Germans, they talk about convoys being attacked, ambushes, skirmishes with an unknown number of Americans. And after a couple weeks, the fighting dies down in the woods. And now on January 25th and 26th, the area is liberated again after the American army comes back. And a couple weeks later, a local villager goes into the woods and says there's bodies of American soldiers still out in the woods. And one of those bodies eventually turns out to be Lieutenant Erich Fisher-Wood, surrounded by 7 German bodies. And that's kind of where the myth began. Is the story goes, he was the last man to die on the site, surrounded by 7 Germans, which he killed personally.
Yeah, typical John Rambo style.
It's the Rambo of the Ardennes is often referred to. So that's the starting point actually of the story. There's an article in the Saturday Evening Post that appears in 1947. It's called "The Incredible Valor of Erich Wood," and kind of tells that story.
Lieutenant Erich Wood, he has his nice memorial on a hill just before you get to Mayer Road. It's about maybe 50, 60 yards from where his body was found, or 100 yards from where his body was found. He is buried in the Henry Chapelle Cemetery in Belgium. Yep. So it's an amazing story, but more important at the beginning, because the battery he was responsible for, he said 3 guns ultimately made it across the Our River, but then it seems that they had played a significant role, a very, very significant role in what happened the days just before Christmas.
Those 3 guns eventually ended up on Barrage de Fraiture, one of the highest peaks in Belgium, and it later became known as Parker's Crossroads. So those 3 105mm howitzers and the remnants of the 589th Field Artillery Battalion, they were led by Major Arthur Parker. And Major Parker decided to make a stand, and he did so at one of the key intersections near Mannheim, being that of Barrage de Fraiture, where he set up his guns on the 19th of December, and they made a stand there against the 2nd SS Panzer Division. So it was a defense of about 300 men. It wasn't only the 589th and those 3 guns, but eventually there were stragglers from other units that filtered into that position.
Sent a platoon down there, and
and a couple of Shermans of the 3rd Armored came in. They also had some anti-aircraft half-tracks from the 203rd AAA Battalion.
Yeah, some anti-tank guns there as well. But basically they got at one point before they were overrun, they got completely surrounded, and that for like a day or a day and a half, that was like an Alamo fight.
Exactly. It was a very intense combat there too. a lot of attempts to infiltrate their position by the SS troops, and eventually the Germans sent up their heavy armor and basically went through the defense line. There's very little you can do with a 105 millimeter in that position when you're attacked by a column of Panther tanks. So eventually.
But nowadays, there's a nice memorial dedicated to all the different units that had fought in that area. Also to Arthur Parker, who, by the way, he was wounded during that battle, right?
Yeah, Major Parker was indeed wounded and evacuated shortly before the battle ended there on Parker's Crossroads, and he was evacuated, but eventually became commander of the battalion again after being discharged from the hospital.
Yeah. So now recently they changed that crossroad. They built like a massive roundabout there. So now they have to change all the history books because, change it to Parker's Roundabout.
Parker's Roundabout
right now. So if you look at this, what we've been talking about, the 106, they play such an important role in the Battle of the Bulge, because they kind of, in some ways, changed the outcome at Sankt Vith for holding it for 6 more days at Parker's Crossroad. But nevertheless, there were many prisoners, many guys got wounded.
Yeah, so the prisoners, they went into various prison of war camps. So there was about 7,000 men who were put on trains at Gerolstein, the famous German city known for the mineral water. But Gerolstein was also one of the staging areas where the German trains pulled in with troops and horses. So they had these empty boxcars there, which the prisoners all went into. And they were sent off to the interior of Germany to go to POW camps. And one of those camps was the Stalag 9B at Bad Orb. Particularly bad camp, considered one of the worst POW camps of them all, because there was a lot of disease, illness, malnutrition. Troops weren't given adequate care, lice problems. So it was a very difficult situation to live in. And eventually, 350 of them, they were sent to a place called Berge am Elster, where they had to dig tunnels into slate rock to actually create an underground factory where the Germans were to produce rocket fuel for V2 rockets and their airplanes. So that was a 350-man detail that was sent there and basically worked to death. They were slave laborers. They didn't have any protection of the Geneva Convention. They were really maltreated, and a lot of them died eventually on a death march. I think about 70 of them ended up passing.
Wow. Actually, sometimes it was even worse than being in combat.
Yes,
for some of these men.
Yeah, I think so. They really had some hardships in those camps, and it depended on the location, but yeah, some camps were definitely worse than others. And if you had the bad luck of being put in a work detail where you were mistreated, you were in for a bad experience. And I really, every time I meet an ex-POW, it's really, I really admire their persistence, their will to survive, because that's really what they did. Is they had a real will to survive and get through that horrible experience, initially in combat, and afterwards, that POW experience, which was probably in some cases worse.
So your website, of course, we're going to promote it. It's I recommend everybody go take a look. It's like a tremendous source of information, maps, stories, and details about that great Golden Lion division. But it's not just that what you do, right, Carl? Because you have your annual ceremony. Because you've been guiding, you've been taking these veterans, John Gatens, John Schaffner, all the guys, you've been taking them back to these battle sites for many, many years. Also a lot of families of these veterans of the 106th Division. But you have your own project. You do like the Flags of Friendship project. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the Flags of Friendship project is actually something that was started by my good friend and colleague, Doug Mitchell, who's American, who lives actually right on the front lines where the 106th were positioned in December. And he got the idea of, why don't the American soldiers who fought here in Europe of the 106th, after so many years of being thanked by the Belgians and the Dutch and the French and the Luxembourg people for what they did in World War II, why don't we reverse it? And now the veterans thank one of the locals for their efforts in preserving and perpetuating the history of the division and the U.S. Army and Battle of the Bulge in general. That was kind of the mindset of that project, and that's been a ceremony that we've been doing for a couple of years now in St. Vith at the 106th Division Memorial, and it's typically the gift of an American flag to an individual who has shown great interest and effort in perpetuating the history of the 106th.
So you're actually doing the monuments, the ceremony, taking veterans and their families around. So it seems you're doing a tremendous job in preserving the history of the 106th Division. And now I really understand why you have been adopted by the division as the European historian of the division. Because if there's one person who deserves it, it's you, Carl, for all the good work you do. Much appreciated. I got one little question, because I've been looking at that uniform behind you for quite some time now. What's the story of the uniform?
This uniform belonged to a man called Frederick Chase. He was a driver for a weapons platoon in the 422nd Infantry, and he was actually one of the men of the Lost 500.
Okay.
We talked about. So he was one of the men captured on 21st of December 44 in that small group of 500 men in that motor pool area. And he ended up prisoner of war in Stalag 4B, and eventually various work details ending up near Halle, I think, surviving a bombing there. And he's also one of the past presidents of the 106th Division Association. So it's one of the uniforms I have, which have a lot of history behind them, and I tend to preserve for future generations.
Well, a uniform is nice, but the story that goes with it is often much nicer than that.
That's exactly true.
The Lost 500, because of course, the exact location where they actually surrendered on the 21st of December. I know there were plans in the past to put like a nice little memorial there as well. Maybe. So maybe for people if who watch this and they want to contribute, feel free to contact us. We put you in touch with Carl if you want to support that project financially or any other way. Please feel free to contact us at any time. Meanwhile, Carl, I cannot thank you enough for clearing this out about the 106th Division, because these guys are among all the great World War II heroes, and they did just the same thing as all the others did during the Battle of the Bulge.
They sure did.
Fighting for their life, fighting for freedom. So thank you very much for your time, for being here with us. And when this COVID thing is over, I'm really looking forward to seeing you back in the battlefields.
Me too. We will have to meet there again and dig into some more 106 history there.
Absolutely. I can't wait. Thanks very much for your time, Carl. And people, I hope you enjoyed this talk about the 106th Infantry Division. I hope they get the credit they deserve now, and all this wrong perceptions about the surrender, forget about it and look at it in a different way with all the information that you have received right now, because they really deserve that. Thank you very much. See you next time, hopefully. And Tony, back to you.
That's it, everybody. That's our show. Many, many thanks to co-host Red Johns and our special guest, Carl Wouters. You did an incredible job. We will do our best to spread the information and let the world know that the 106th Infantry Division did an incredible job there at the Battle of the Bulge. So thank you both again for a great episode. Everybody, you can visit our website at bunkerboys.com. All of our episodes are free now, so go back and rewatch some of those episodes. We've got some great ones coming up here soon with the Roland Gall of Gall's Legacy Tours, and of course David Harper coming up with Eagle's Nest Historical Tours, and a couple extra episodes too. One on Italy, and of course one on Market Garden coming up. So some good stuff coming up. Please support us at patreon.com. /Bunker Boys, patreon.com /Bunker Boys. That's where you can support us, give us a donation, or even subscribe to the Bunker Boys show. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in a couple weeks, and take care for now. America, I salute you.